All right, welcome everyone, and good evening. Thank you to everyone for coming. And this is our second class in the series of Jews and the Nobel Prize, where we'll be speaking about different Jews and who won Nobel Prizes and the impact that they had on the world that we live in. I have to give a disclaimer before I start speaking because, it says when God speaks to Moses, he tells him, remove the shoes from your feet and the burning bush, because this is a holy place. And obviously, this is a very sacred topic, because when we speak about Elie Wiesel, we're not only speaking about him, but we're speaking about the Holocaust. And so the topic is a very sacred and wide topic. It's also a topic where I have to give a disclaimer because Elie Wiesel lived in this area, and I unfortunately didn't know him, but some of you have, and some of you have met him, and it's just important to acknowledge that obviously there's a big difference between knowing him in person and knowing about him. So you might ask why it is that I'm going to speak about him, even though I didn't know him, so the answer is it's important to know that again, Elie Wiesel doesn't just represent himself as a person, but also speaking about the Holocaust, what the Holocaust meant, and that's what we're going to speak about. Like speaking about Albert Einstein, also I'd like to point out there's a very big difference between the way we speak about Elie Wiesel as Jews versus what Elie Wiesel meant to the world. Elie Wiesel meant a great deal to the world. He was a moral voice. He was a forceful storyteller who was able to really convey stories with incredible clarity. And yet at the same time, a lot of what he said meant completely different things to people who are Jewish versus not Jewish, just because as Jews, we share more intimate space with Elie Wiesel, whether it's in terms of speaking about family members who we lost during the Holocaust, or just the concept of faith, which he often speaks of in a Jewish context. So let me, with that disclaimer, let me start. It's also important to note that when we speak of Elie Wiesel and telling the story of the Holocaust, it's not something we can take for granted. And what do I mean by that? There are no less than 18 Jewish writers who, following the Holocaust, wrote about the Holocaust, wrote poetry. And in the course of writing their memoirs, their poetry, following it, they committed suicide. Writing about the Holocaust, recounting the memories, speaking of what you've been through is not a simple experience. And so we say sometimes in retrospect, oh, of course, he sat and he wrote and, he was just a good author. It wasn't something that you can take for granted. To be able to look back at the horrors of the Holocaust as someone who's been through them and to write about it is not something that is simple at all, and not something that we can take for granted. And so just the fact that he did that was in a way putting himself in harm's way. Sometimes we say, wow, he's a author and a bestseller, and he sold copies, tens of millions, that were translated to more than 30 languages. But at the same time, it's important to note that that was a sacrifice that he made. And if you think, for those who remember and know about it, there's a very famous author. Has anyone ever heard of an author named Katzetnik, Yechiel Dinur? So he is most famous from the Eichmann trial. Katzetnik spoke in the Eichmann trial, and more than he spoke with his words, he spoke with what happened to him. He got up to speak. He was the author. He wrote about the Holocaust, and he collapsed on the stand of the witness, and he collapsed. Now, that scene echoed throughout the world, but also people don't know he was in the hospital for 7 months after that testimony. So Katzetnik was a man who's been through the Holocaust. He wrote about the Holocaust in the 50s, and yet when he got up to speak at the Eichmann trial, he was so shocked by just bringing out some of those testimonies that he ended up in the hospital for 7 months. And so when we speak about Elie Wiesel writing about the Holocaust, we're not just talking about a bestseller. We're not just talking about an author. We're talking about someone who, with courage, looked the Holocaust in the eye, as my friend Rabbi Pollack, who was a friend of his, said, and wrote about it. So it's just important that we appreciate that. Another important thing when we speak about Elie Wiesel and his work is to appreciate the difference between storytelling and being a witness. What happened after the Holocaust is that you had a new kind of writers. You had a new kind of writers, meaning these were not people that were writing stories. These were people who were offering testimony in a place that many people did not necessarily speak about that topic. A lot of people in the 50s didn't speak much about the Holocaust, understandably, and yet when people did speak, it was a testimony. It was a testimony for future generations. And so the scholars make the distinction between the concept of being a writer and the concept of being someone who is a witness. The Torah says in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, you should write this song, the Torah, what you write is going to be a witness. And so when Elie Wiesel is writing, even when he's writing fiction, conveying some kind of idea, it's important to note that it's a kind of testimony. They were the first witnesses to go and tell the world about what happened. And it's a completely different kind of literature. It's a different kind of writing. And that's what he did. He gave voice not only to 6 million Jews who lost their lives, but he also gave voice to 3.5 million Jews who survived. People were not able to speak about the trauma. There was no public space for the trauma until really people like Elie Wiesel started writing about it and bringing it to the public conscience. For those who read his book, Night, he has a story in the first chapter about a fellow named Moshe the Beadle, who goes from his town of Seagate, goes to Poland, sees the mass shootings, the graves, and he comes back to Seagate. He comes and he tells people, and everyone thinks that he's crazy. No one wants to listen to the stories. And in fact, Seagate is out of the reach of the Nazis until 1944. And in those years, even though they had this guy walking among them, they did not heed his warnings or even believe his accounts. And so for many Jews after the Holocaust, there was no one who would really validate what they'd been through. Some of the experiences were just so horrible that no one would believe them even after they took place. And so when speaking out, Elie Wiesel really made space not only for the 6 million who lost their lives, but also for the 3.5 million who survived. In some ways, he was both a witness, a storyteller, a therapist, a theologian, and also a prosecutor. There's an interesting anecdote that some Israeli pointed out, and that is in one of the first scenes that Elie Wiesel speaks about is in Auschwitz, where obviously, countless people were being killed every day, and yet there was one of the more traumatizing experiences was the public hangings. They would bring especially young people who disobeyed or stepped out of line, and they would hang them in front of everyone. And for hours, all the prisoners had to stand there in the cold, had to stare in the eyes, the young people who were being hanged until the end of their verdict, until they died. And so Elie Wiesel, I believe in 1947 already, starts writing about some of these experiences. And he writes also about, he contrasts it with a fictional question of what if he would be a member of the Irgun. And for those who don't know the background, Menachem Begin's Irgun was operating in Israel, fighting against the British, and the British started punishing some of the members of the Irgun with hanging. And so the Irgun decided to take a retaliatory step, and they kidnapped 2 British sergeants and they hung them. And they hung them in a forest, and that shocked the British. And Elie Wiesel writes this fictional book following night, a book called Dawn, where he writes, what if I would be in the Irgun? What if I would have to hang those British sergeants? Following my experience as a victim of the Nazis, would I do it? And it's interesting how he contrasts those 2 hangings. 1964-65, Eichmann is brought to Israel. What's the punishment that's chosen for Eichmann? Hanging. It's a very powerful sequence where sort of Elie Wiesel's storytelling carries from one generation to the other, and this power of the cruelty of the Nazis being invoked in terms of their hanging someone retaliated on Eichmann is something that obviously resonated very widely. And so in many ways, what he wrote shaped the way we view the Holocaust and the way Holocaust survivors were able to experience life following the Holocaust. Again, I have to give a disclaimer because we have someone here whose parents were in the same barrack in Auschwitz with Elie Wiesel. Do you want to add something?
No, I just want to add that Elie Wiesel was many things: philosopher, thinker, Nobel Prize winner, writer, but he wanted to be remembered as teacher.
Yes, I'm going to speak about, in fact, this is all the introduction, but you're right. Thank you. And he did want to be remembered as a teacher. And so I'm going to speak about that. So one more item, which is part of this introduction, is the story about the watch. In the nights and before the Jews of Seagate know that they're going to be, before they're going to be expelled from the town, Elie's father takes the gold and the silver that they had, and he hides it in the backyard. And so once he hides it in the backyard, Elie takes a golden watch that he has, and he puts it in the backyard. He remembers exactly where he put it, 3 steps from this tree, and 3 steps, I think, from the willow tree. He puts it under there. He buries it in the ground. 20, 30 years go by. He survives the Holocaust, and he goes through so much. And he goes back to visit the town of Seagate. And as he's staying in his hotel in the dark of night, he decides to go and see what happened to this watch. And he goes quietly to the backyard of his house, and he follows the steps that he memorized. He digs exactly in the spot, and there's the watch. The watch is there, and it's a bit rusty, and he takes it out, and it's the golden watch. It's rusty, but it's there. And he stops for a moment, he freezes, he puts the watch back, and he buries it, and he goes back to his hotel room, and he leaves it there. And I think that, to me, is such a powerful story that captures what he and so many survivors went through. On the one hand, you want to go back, you want to dig up that watch, those memories, the treasures, what you had from before the war. But on the other hand, there's a huge need to leave everything behind, the need to sort of restart and kind of repress some of those memories and move on and rebuild. That's why so many survivors, in fact, almost every survivor, didn't think about revenge, didn't think about a lot with going back. They were focused forward. So I think that story with the watch, with Elie Wiesel, really captures his essence and also the essence of those who survived the Holocaust, the conflict between going back to get the treasure versus just leaving everything behind. So with that brief introduction, let's now speak about Elie Wiesel. So Elie was born in 1928 to a very religious family, a Hasidic family. His parents, Elisha and Sarah Wiesel, were very religious people. They were owners of a small shop in the town of Seagate. And Elie is very devoted to his studies. He studies Talmud. He's actually fascinated by Kabbalah, which is something we shouldn't ignore because his attraction to the mystical and philosophy is something that carries him throughout his life. And this is what he does. He lives a very wholesome life. He's dedicated to learning. He's with his family. His father is one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Seagate, and things seem fine. In 1940, the Germans come, but Hungary did not, because they were allied with Germany, they didn't have the same German occupation as Poland, for example, and so the Jews lived there in relative peace. They heard rumors about what was going on in Poland, but everything seemed fine. In 1944, when Elie's a teenager, the fascist party takes over, and the Jews of Seagate are rounded up in a very quick way, sent to a ghetto, and basically the ghetto shrinks in accordance to the size of the deportation. So with every train that leaves, the ghetto gets smaller and smaller. Because Elie's father is one of the Jewish leaders in the community, their deportation is delayed, and then eventually he too is delayed, and that's where it all really starts becoming a whirlwind. He's deported eventually to Auschwitz, and where he spends the Holocaust. That's where you read the book Night about everything that he's been through. And once the Allies come closer to Auschwitz, he is sent on the death marches with his father and eventually arrives in Buchenwald, where he spends the last few weeks before the war is over and before he's liberated by the Red Army. It's interesting that one of the central themes of his book and his psyche and his life is his father, because his father is not only an extraordinary role model, he's a Jewish community leader, he's someone who goes to visit Jews in the hospital, in the prison, wherever they may be. And he's also managing communal affair, which means these meetings take place in Elie's house. And so that's something that really very much resonates with him. Throughout the Holocaust, he is in a way lucky to be with his father. Throughout his time in Auschwitz, his father is there with him, and they're there for one another. They march together on the death marches, and it's really in the very, very last few days of the war that after the brutal death marches, his father dies shortly before liberation. So that's another thing that sort of carries with him. It's interesting. There's a story. I don't know how many people know this story, but most of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Allgemeiner newspaper. And there was a fellow named Gershon Jacobson. His son is a famous Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, Yosef Jacobson. And basically, Rabbi Gershon Jacobson invites Elie Wiesel. It's a small world of Jewish journalism. So he's with the Allgemeiner and Elie's with the Forward. And he invites him to his house to sit and talk to him. He interviews Elie Wiesel, and his son, Rabbi Yosef Jacobson, who's very well known today, I don't know if anyone has heard him speak, is sitting in the room nearby. He's sitting in the room right next to the interview. And he hears his father, Gershon Jacobson, ask Elie Wiesel, he says, tell me, what was the most humiliating moment in your time in Auschwitz? And you would think that the answer would be something that a German did to him. There were times that he received lashes. There was humiliating labor. And he says, here's what was the most humiliating moment for me during the Holocaust. He says, it was towards the end. I'm walking with my father, and the only thing you can think about at the time is food, which is something many survivors of the camp speak about. The thinking of food at all times is something that is thankfully something we're not even able to fathom. But it's just all your thoughts, every one of them is about food. And he says they receive the portion at the end of the day. And his father receives some soup and bread, and he receives some soup and bread, and they're walking back to his camp. And he thinks to himself for a moment. He says, if just my father can die now right here, and I will take his food, that would be amazing. And he turns to his father and he tells him this, and he says, this is what the Germans wanted to make of us. He said they wanted to make of us like insects, that a child who loves his father so much would think that he wishes that his father dies so he can get a piece of bread. That is what they wanted to do to us. And that's when he's sitting in Brooklyn, in East New York, and he's sitting with this Gershon Jacobson, and he breaks down in tears. And clearly, whether it's the last moments with his father or these moments where he's, experiencing, he's very self-aware of his thoughts, were very difficult for him. So the tragedy of the Holocaust for him is a mixture of both what he's been through with his father and also the loss of his father towards the end. After the Holocaust was over and after liberation from Buchenwald, Elie is sent to an orphanage in France where he has a very mystical teacher. His name is Mr. Shoshani. He was later the teacher also of Emmanuel Levinas. He's actually a mystical figure in and of himself, very interesting person. And he starts working, believe it or not. Does anyone know what his first job was? His first job is working for the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot, which is an Israeli newspaper. He starts working as a reporter for Yediot Achronot. He continues, he starts writing, but he's not writing about anything related to the Holocaust. He's a news reporter. And then Nobel laureate Francois Maurice, who's not Jewish and knows him in France, where he's studying in the Sorbonne. He studied already in the Sorbonne. He encourages him to write about what he's been through in the Holocaust. And so he starts writing about the Holocaust, and he starts writing this book called Night, which is originally published in what language? In Yiddish. He writes it in Yiddish in a name that we all use today. It's called Und der Welt hat geschwiegen, which means, and the world remained silent. Anyone ever hear that expression, and the world remained silent, when speaking about the Holocaust? And that really was the essence of his takeaway from the Holocaust. It was the war he waged against indifference, right? His famous saying that the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. And so this is what he does. He starts writing about the Holocaust, and his first publication is in Yiddish. Interestingly, his publication is originally rejected by about 24 publishers, and eventually it's accepted. Eventually it's translated into France, and later it goes into many, many different languages. 1956, Elie Wiesel comes to New York, and unfortunately a tragedy happens here, where he gets hit by a taxi, and he gets into a car accident, and for a full year he's homebound. He can't leave his house. But that's really when he becomes an American figure, and he starts writing a lot for different publications. And that's really where he starts gaining more and more fame, using his voice to help others. This is a very interesting, by the way, I don't know if this is the first place you'll be hearing about this, but sort of a, I guess, tip for those who are listening now. There's a movie, a documentary coming up about Elie Wiesel, called Elie Wiesel Soul on Fire. There's a so you're hearing about it here first. It's coming soon. And there's a fellow who went to, I think he's a third generation Yeshiva University graduate. His name is Ted Comet, and he was a lifelong friend of Elie Wiesel. He went to France in 1946 as a student from Yeshiva University, going with the Joint to help out with survivors. And he really is helping produce this beautiful video about Elie Wiesel. And so he asks Elie Wiesel, he says to him, what do you do? Like, what is your essence? And that's what you were saying, that he says, I am a magid. Does anyone know what a magid means? A storyteller. In Europe, what happened was there would be, every town would have sometimes a scholar in residence, so to speak, and a magid would be someone who would schlep from town to town, and he would get up in shul and he would speak words of inspiration, usually mixed in with stories, and that is how Elie Wiesel saw himself. So he said he's a magid, but then he continues and he asks Elie, he says, what's your essence? So Elie Wiesel speaking to him, and then he famously said this at a dinner of the Federation of the United Federations of North America. He says to him, he says, you know why I was able to survive all of that? You know what was the point of surviving? He says words that are now we take for granted. One word actually. He says zachor. My role is at this point to tell the story of the Holocaust, to remember the story of the Holocaust, and to give voice to those who died. Anyone ever see the trial of Eichmann? Anyone ever hear Gideon Hausner speaking? What does he say when he starts speaking? When he's prosecuting Eichmann?
He's speaking in the name of the 6 million.
Exactly. So Gideon Hausner is prosecuting Eichmann. He says, I'm not speaking here on behalf of myself. I'm speaking on behalf of the 6 million. And so in a way, Elie Wiesel was not prosecuting in the name of 6 million. He was zachor. He was giving memory to the 6 million. That was his primary function. And that was what he was going to do. For the rest of his life, he was going to make sure that people remember the Holocaust, as well as that we make sure not to be indifferent to anything else. And he did this. This is another point. He did this in the face of anyone. There was nothing. Elie had no problem speaking truth to power, and Mr. Comet shared that this sort of explains 3 of Elie's encounters. I'm going to share with you 4 encounters of Elie with American presidents. So some of them are more famous than others. I'm going to share with you 4 or 5 stories of Elie Wiesel encountering U.S. presidents and how the imperative of zachor really carried with him. The first is with President Jimmy Carter. Very important story. In 1978, Jimmy Carter decides to establish a Holocaust Memorial Council, and obviously following that was the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And he calls Elie Wiesel and he says, I want to build a museum for Holocaust remembrance, but I want it to be universal. I wanted to speak about all the atrocities of the Holocaust and all the victims of the Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel said no. Why? Because the Holocaust was a uniquely Jewish experience, as this is something he argued throughout his life. Yes, there were many other victims of the Holocaust. There were, Poles, gays, gypsies, disabled people. Many, many different groups were targeted by the Nazis, but there was nothing as central to the Nazi plan of annihilation as annihilating the Jews. There was nothing they diverted more resources for, and there was nothing that was more accepted by silence of the world than the persecution of the Jews. So if you go today to the Holocaust Museum, you'll see there's a section there for other groups persecuted by the Nazis, but the central message of the Holocaust and the central attempt of the Germans was against the Jewish people, and the lesson we should learn from that is obviously against all hate, but the danger of anti-Semitism, the danger of targeting the Jewish people. As Rabbi Sachs says, the Jews always go first. Any group that starts hating the Jews usually ends up following with hate of others. And so that was one disagreement that he had. When Jimmy Carter said, I want you to join, he refused. And he said, unless this is something that focuses on the unique experience of the Holocaust as an experience persecuting the Jewish people, I will not join that. And eventually Carter agreed. And this was something that he strongly argued about. That is that the Holocaust is a uniquely Jewish targeted experience, but at the same time, it has universal lessons. So the persecution of the Jews was what was central. And then later, there are many, many humanitarian and universal lessons against various forms of hate, racism, etc. But it was the Nazi campaign was against the Jews. The second episode where Elie Wiesel really spoke truth to power and had no problem even confronting the president of the United States was a very dark episode. Some of you might remember with Ronald Reagan in 1985. So there was supposed to be a 40 years to the end of World War II ceremony in Germany. And Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of Germany, invites President Reagan to come. And he says to him, when you come, you're going to go visit the Bitburg cemetery. The Bitburg cemetery is where German soldiers are buried. So first of all, it's German soldiers, right? These were not people who were fighting on behalf of anything good. Second of all, a large number of the people buried there in that cemetery were of the Waffen-SS. So there were a bunch of Waffen-SS people buried there. And not only that, there was no plan to visit a concentration camp on the itinerary. So the Jewish community, as we would say, raised a Gewalt and made a big fuss about it because it was, sometimes the apology is worse than the crime. And so President Reagan doubled down with some very unfortunate statements. And it happened to be the same time that Elie Wiesel was receiving the Congressional Medal. And so standing in the Congress, he turned directly to the president and had no problem saying, do not go to the Bitburg Cemetery, do not honor these Nazis. And eventually what happened was the visit was shortened, and he also made sure to visit Bergen-Belsen. A story that many, many more might remember is the story with President Clinton in 1995. When you had the massacres and the genocide between Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Srebrenica genocides, where more than 8,000 Muslims were killed, Elie Wiesel spoke very forcefully. He believed that no one had the right to remain silent in the face of evil. He believed that how can you tell future generations that we're angry that no one said anything during the Holocaust, and then when we have the ability to speak out, we don't speak out? You can't do that. And so no matter what it was, no matter to whom he spoke, he would speak truth to power, and he would speak against injustice. And so he famously said, President Clinton, send in troops. And once that threat was a real threat, there was the Dayton Accord, which led to a peace agreement. It's interesting. Another less frictional encounter he had with the U.S. president was with President George Bush. Elie Wiesel went to visit Jonathan Pollard. And he said, obviously, he shouldn't have done what he did, but Pollard was being held in extraordinarily punitive conditions. At some point, they held him in really denigrating conditions. And so he met with him. Funny story, if we can, this evening, is that he walks in to meet Jonathan Pollard in this maximum security prison. And the first words he tells Jonathan Pollard is, Jonathan, do not tell me any information that I should not know, because Jonathan Pollard was accused of espionage. So he said, first thing, don't tell me anything. That's number one. But then they went on to have a very friendly conversation. And Elie Wiesel goes to meet with President Bush, and he says, look, I want you to do something about Pollard. At that time, the established American Jewish community would not speak about Pollard because obviously everyone was uncomfortable. He did spy. And George Bush told him, I didn't know it was actually an issue that the Jewish community cared about. Believe it or not, he said that. He said, I didn't know that. And nonetheless, he said, yes, it is. And eventually, Pollard's condition got better and better until eventually he was let free and went to Israel. And now I think the most difficult subject about Elie Wiesel, and the most important one, and that is his relationship with God. Because this is obviously, let me just say a few things. First of all, if you look at Wiesel's writing about the Holocaust, every single part of it has to do with God. Peppered throughout his book Night is his turning to God and saying, what is this? And it's another important note is that the questions he has to God are not universal, and they're not necessarily questions that every single person in the world relates to in the same way. What do I mean? He wasn't asking, how could it be that children are going into the gas chambers and God, who's almighty and compassionate, does not do anything? His question is really a Jewish question. He says, how do we say the blessing of Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu? How do we say, God, you loved us more than every nation? He says, how do we say, Ata bechartanu mikol amim? You chose us from all nations, and look, this is what we've been chosen for, the crematorium, the gas chambers. And so it's a really uniquely Jewish question. He says, how can we be the chosen nation, and yet we are most tortured and persecuted more than any nation? Is this what we've been chosen for? And this is the question that resonates with him throughout his life. It is, how can this happen? And it's interesting also to note throughout his life, the dichotomy sometimes between practice and faith. He doesn't stop asking questions. He doesn't stop even speaking at God, angry, rightfully so. But at the same time, he wakes up with his father and he lines up to put on tefillin before dawn with a pair of tefillin that someone gave 2 portions of bread for to get into the camp. At the same time, he says that the moment he exits Auschwitz, and he's in this orphanage in France, he asks for the same tractate of Talmud, the same page that he stopped learning when he entered Auschwitz. He came to Auschwitz with a tractate of Talmud, and he, upon liberation from Buchenwald, he asks for the same tractate and continues from the exact same page. And just a very important note is he says, people ask me, how is it that people walked out of Auschwitz believing in God? And he said, that's not the most important question. The most important question is, how did we walk out of that place sane? How can you walk out lucid in your mind? How could you lead any kind of normal life when you've seen what you've seen there? And he says, the learning, the study of Torah actually helped me restore my sanity. Without that, I would not have sanity, because I had the ability to go back to something and I just drowned myself in learning. And so that's a very powerful experience. And that's something that also speaks a great deal of his faith. Again, I spoke today to my friend, Rabbi Joseph Pollack, who's a rabbi at BU, Boston University, and that's where Wiesel was a professor. And he tells me that Elie had a traumatic relationship with God. And I think that's very true. It's a relationship that's fraught with trauma. And it's a relationship that really is, no matter what the ups and downs of it are, it's always a relationship. It's always there. It could be a relationship of anger. It can be a resentment. It can be questioning. But it's always there. It's always a relationship. And he tells me that there was not a single day that Elie Wiesel did not put on tefillin, There was not a single Shabbat that he did not observe, and there was not a single week that went by that he didn't study Torah with him. And it's that commitment that he had and the legitimacy of his questions that led the Orthodox world, we're going to see that in a moment, even the most Orthodox parts of the Orthodox world, to respect him and his questions and take him seriously. No one can ignore him or his questions. And so no matter how profound or sharp his questions were, he was respected in the most religious parts of the Orthodox community because his questions didn't represent his own questions. His questions represented legitimate questions and questions that many, many thousands of others who did not make it out of Auschwitz had. And so he was echoing those questions, and those questions deserved to be addressed. And that's why no one disregarded him. Just wanted to speak quickly a few perspectives that he had on the Torah throughout the Torah. And so like my friend Rabbi Pollack told him is that the Holocaust really was the prism through which he saw everything. And it's important that we take that prism for a moment. So going through the Torah, one of the most central parts to him was the story of the Akedah. And you can understand that for several reasons. First of all, because of his relationship with his father. You think of Abraham and Isaac walking towards Mount Moriah, and Abraham is holding the knife. And so you think of that father-son relationship. And then obviously the idea of sacrifice and children being sacrificed was something that was part and parcel of his vision of the world, which was all through the prism of the Holocaust. Interestingly, Elie Wiesel's take on the Akedah, on the binding of Isaac, as we're going to see later, was one that actually Abraham was testing God. Abraham was saying, you know what, God, I want to see if you're going to have me go through with this. And so we're going to see that really everything that Elie saw was through the prism of the Holocaust. It's interesting. I mentioned the relationship he had with rabbis. He had a relationship with rabbis like even the greatest rabbis can be jealous of that. What do I mean? Some of the greatest rabbis he was friends with were his landsmen. Does everyone know what a landsman is? Landsman means someone who's from your from the Altaheim, they come from where you come from. And that was a special bond even for Jews who came to America in the 1800s. If you were from this town, you lived on this block in New York where people from your town came from. And so some of those people were his landsmen. Famously from JTS, Professor David Halivni Weiss was a landsman of his and a close friend of his. And interestingly, Rabbi Menashe Klein, who is one of the most ultra-Orthodox rabbis that lived in America, was such a close friend of his that he would speak to him every single Friday. Before Shabbat, he would speak to this rabbi. So some of these great rabbis were his friends because they were landsmen. They grew up in the same area. They would speak all the time. And then there was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, very interesting history. So this person, Gershon Jacobson, who wrote for the Allgemeiner in Yiddish, was a Chabad Chassid, and he invited him to come see the Rebbe in action. And he says, I looked at the Rebbe, I saw all of the pain of the Jewish people on his face, and he saw what the Rebbe was doing to rebuild, and he came close with him. He eventually was invited to speak to the Rebbe intimately, and he continued to speak to him and ask him the most difficult questions that he had. Sometimes they spoke for 7 hours straight, and they would just speak about everything that he'd been through. There's a story Rabbi Jacobson, I think, tells that one day he's speaking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says to him, look, you've been through so much. Is there something I can do to help you? Is there something I can give you? So no, he turns around, he goes back to the door, and he comes back and he turns to the Rebbe and he says, yes, there is something I want from you. What's the thing? He says, since my father died in Buchenwald, I had not been able to cry once. I was never able to cry. After that, I lost the ability to cry. And he turns to the Rebbe and he says, I want you to give me the ability to cry again, because I haven't been able to cry since. And the Rebbe looks at him and he says, like only a true chassid would say, he says, I'm going to help you. I'll give you the ability to cry again. But the only way I can do that is if I first give you the ability to sing and to dance. And he says, if I'm going to do that, I'll give you the ability to sing and to dance, then you'll be able to also experience crying again. Very moving story. But he really had an incredible relationship with the most religious figures, which is, if you only read pop culture or observed him from the outside, you wouldn't think he had that. But he did. He had that relationship. Another person he was close with was the head of the yeshiva in Gush Etzion in Israel, Rabbi Amital. And it's a really moving experience. I saw there's a video up on YouTube of him coming to speak in the yeshiva. And I think it encapsulates his relationship both with religion and religious leaders. He walks into the yeshiva. Everyone's there, the students and the rabbis, and he gets up to the podium to speak. And he speaks first respectfully, but then he speaks in the sharpest way possible. Imagine a yeshiva full of yeshiva students devoted to Judaism, to their studies. And what does Elie Wiesel say? He speaks about what they saw in Auschwitz. He says, how can you say in Auschwitz, Ata bechartanu, you, God, have chosen us? And he speaks about the approach of Rabbi Amital to the Holocaust. He says, how can some people be telling me that you say the Holocaust was justified in the sense that it led up to the state of Israel? How can anyone say this is a price you pay for the state of Israel? And yet he ends off on the most respectful tone and receives a most warm welcome. And I think that really captures who he was, because nobody thought that he was being disrespectful. People knew that his heart was bleeding. People knew that he's asking questions that needed to be asked. He's asking questions that were on the minds of people in Auschwitz before they died. He was asking questions that everyone there standing in Auschwitz was saying, not everyone, but many, where is God in this place? What is going on? And so people treated that respectfully, and there was a legitimacy to it. And as long as he was the one saying it with his sweetness and kindness, people took it very seriously. Just another thing that went on both between him and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but just in general in life, is some said he had this hesitancy to get married. He didn't want to get married. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very into pressuring him to get married, which is never a good idea to pressure someone, but he would pressure him a lot to get married, and he spoke to him about the need to rebuild. But eventually, as my friend Rabbi Pollack said, he got married when the time was right, and he met his wife and married, I believe, in New York. Just another quick, again, mentioning of his thoughts on the Torah. So you have the Akedah, him speaking about how it was actually Abraham testing God. You have Elie Wiesel speaking of Sodom, the city destroyed, and he says, where were the 10 righteous people to save us? If God was willing to spare the city of Sodom, the wicked of Sodom, if there were 10 righteous people, how come there was no one there for us? He speaks of Hagar, the wife of Abraham, the maid who sent away, and the power of exile on her. And he says that was one exile. Look what we have been through. Throughout, he's always seeing things through the prism of the Holocaust. The silence of Aaron when his sons die young. And so that's, again, something that he says is something that, echoes the voice of those of the Holocaust, where sometimes silence speaks louder than words. And then finally, I just want to read a letter, speaking of the Nobel Prize, of a fellow named Abba Kovner. Has anyone ever heard of Abba Kovner? Abba Kovner is a fascinating figure, sometimes controversial. He was one of the only Jews to survive the Vilna ghetto. He was a partisan. He fought fiercely. Then he was one of a group called Nakam that planned revenge after the Holocaust and planned to basically kill Germans in the years following. But then he moved to Israel and directed his attention at rebuilding or building the young state. And he writes to Elie Wiesel something about him receiving a Nobel, which I think it really captures what it is. I'm going to translate freely from Hebrew. He says, between the many Jews who received the Nobel Prize, I believe there is not one person who received the Nobel Prize on something that is glatt Jewish. Glatt, anyone ever hear of glatt kosher, like super kosher? He says, I believe there is not a single Jew who received the Nobel for something that is glatt Jewish. He says for generations, for years, the Jews who received the Nobel received it because of a certain scientific achievement, medical achievement, literary, etc. But he says that you really got the Jewish Nobel. And he says that someone who has taken the awful, awful experience of the Holocaust that you've been through and has forced the entire world to look at this issue and reckon with it and bring it into the collective human memory, that is something that is both recognizes your greatness, and it also is the recognition in the particularity and universality of the Holocaust. And this is really true, because what Elie Wiesel did was to universalize the particularity of the Holocaust. He was the first to really tell the world about this distinct experience that no other people had been through. And so he is the one who transformed the Holocaust from just being a particular experience to a lesson that can teach the world about something. And so the Holocaust, in terms of what Elie Wiesel did it, and this is what articulated by Abba Kovner, is that he took something, he explained to the world why it's unique to the Jewish people and why its lessons are universal. And finally, something that really brought two things that brought tears to my eyes. Elie Wiesel wrote a book about the Eichmann trial. Many people don't know that. And he put it away. He set it aside. He didn't publish it. Why? Because in the 1950s and 60s, he already was becoming a celebrity. And many Israeli authors in Israel, the market is not as big as in America. And they needed him. And they used him in a good way when they wanted, if you wanted someone to put in a good word for you in a university, I spoke last week about how Einstein did this for many other Jews. And so Elie Wiesel really helped a lot of these Israeli authors who had a limited contact list. And so there was an Israeli author named Chaim Guri who wrote a book about the Holocaust, about the Eichmann trial. Elie helped him get it published. It's published. You can find it on Amazon. I think it's called The Man Behind the Glass Curtain. And once Elie Wiesel knew that Chaim Guri was publishing this, he put his copy aside. He didn't publish it. And that's such a powerful thing as an author, to be able to put something aside, because you know that you've sold millions and there's this Israeli author who may not have that kind of reach, and you put away an entire book. That to me is something only a very righteous man would do. And finally, a letter, 1997, in the New York Times, famous letter, Elie Wiesel writes, "Master of the universe, let us make up. It is time. How long can we go on being angry? More than 50 years have passed since the nightmare was lifted. Many things, good and less good, have since happened to those who survived it. They learned to build on ruins. Family life was recreated. Children were born. Friendships struck. They learned to have faith in their surroundings, even in their fellow men and women." And so I think it goes on to write how, in a way, God is also a grieving member of the Jewish people. And he says, we ask so many questions about God in Auschwitz, but it was his children who were being murdered there. And he goes to change his approach to a much softer approach, saying, God, I recognize that a lot of my anger may have been appropriate back then, but let's be friends again, because you too have lost 6 million of your children in Auschwitz. And I think that's something that transformed in his perspective over the years. So may his memory be a blessing, the memory of all those who perished be a blessing, and may we all be blessed really to carry on that message of Zachor, of speaking out, of not being indifferent, and making sure that the memory of those who've lost and the lessons that we learn from that carry on. And I must say that to myself, having read so much about Elie Wiesel, I would say I'm inspired by his commitment to learning. Those who've seen in the 92nd Street why he would pack thousands of people 3 times a year at Boston University, also thousands of people. His commitment to learning throughout his life is something that should inspire all of us, and may his legacy continue to carry on. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, question. His son is Elisha Wiesel. I'm not going to say what he does because I believe he lives around here, and I probably can speak for himself better than me. But yeah, he has a son, Elisha, who's named for his father. Yeah. So that is that. Anyone questions? His sister and his mother were for sure killed. I believe there was one sister that did survive. who found out from a picture in a newspaper that one of his sisters saw his picture in the newspaper in France and was able to reunite with him. Yeah. You want to come here and speak, by the way, because we have people on Zoom. If you want to. So again, we have someone here whose parents were in the same barrack as Elie in Auschwitz, so just a few words.
Yes, just a few words. Just additional personal anecdotes of Elie Wiesel. First, you mentioned his lectures at the 92nd Street Y, which were sold out months before, and I mean, the way he started, he didn't say ladies and gentlemen, but just started the lecture right away, and after 10 minutes he stopped, and now I welcome all the latecomers. It was very interesting and very funny, and he stopped until everybody else, or all the latecomers, were find the seats that were left, if any left. And then he was patiently signed his books. So that's number one. Number two, he was the keynote speaker in the United Nations in 2006 in the first annual International Holocaust Memorial. 2006, we invited him. I was part of that committee who invited Elie Wiesel. And another anecdote that he was invited to be the president of Israel, the president of State of Israel, right after the mess of President Katsav, who was in jail. And he was invited, and he said no, because he doesn't live in Israel, and he doesn't deserve to be in Israel. He didn't serve in the army of Israel, and so he refused, and rightly so. So that's another anecdote. And now the sad anecdote, that when he was attacked in the elevator in California, in a hotel, he was there for a lecture, and somebody attacked him in the elevator, and he was in hospital, and then he was interviewed about this accident, and Joyce asked him, "Do you hate this guy?" And he said, "No, I pity him, but I don't hate him. I can't hate any person."
Wow. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone. For those wondering, next week we'll be speaking on a very different note about Daniel Kahneman, the great economist from Princeton, and his principles of psychology, what he taught the world about also a fascinating life. Bezrat Hashem will be speaking about him, but thank you everyone for coming and everyone who's listening online, and I'll see you all, Bezrat Hashem, next week. I'll see everyone. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, God. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.